Ever since I moved into the new place, I've been trying to find the time to make a set of bar stools.
A few moments later.
Much better. Let's just say it was a lot longer than a few moments. But as with any project, I like to start with what I'm comfortable with, and that's the metal fab. I started by cutting a few 1x1 by 14 gauge square tube. I added a slight 30-degree angle to the end of the tubes just to give the bar stools a bit of a flare. And besides, let's be honest, nothing's straight nowadays. Besides the square tubes, I had to cut 1, a base plate, and 2, roll this ring. I wasn't sure at the beginning if this was going to be necessary, but it turns out it really helped with the strength and gave it a nice look too. Pretty much everything I build, I start off in SolidWorks and design a CAD model around it. That goes the same with these bar stools, especially with this base plate here. I mean, I could spend hours and a lot of effort trying to cut this thing out by hand. I decided since I had the DXF file, I'm just going to toss this in our company laser machine, which just happens to be $1 million Armada, and it works good, so don't be hating on me for that. After tacking on the support ring came the difficult task of trying to figure out how I can place the cross members not only equal to each other but also level to ensure the stool doesn't rock back and forth. But spoiler alert, even though I got these things fairly dead nuts, it didn't even matter because the floors in my place, they're a bit bowed. Sad day for me. But what I ended up doing is pretty simple, and what I've been noticing is the more simple you keep it, usually, you know, the easier it is. That might sound a little weird, but what I end up doing for the second two is what I should have did for the first one. I didn't have to use any measuring devices. I didn't have to go get a tape, you know. All I did was set the distance for one leg or one cross member, made sure that cross member was level, and then I used that as a reference for all the other ones. All I had to do was clamp a piece of flat bar, and that set the distance. And it was plenty close enough for what I needed. Otherwise, just gonna full weld these, and then it's gonna be off to the seats. I'm going to be honest here. I could have made these seats a lot cheaper and easier to build, but it would have only been about a day's work, and I didn't think that would have made a good video, so I decided to go the long route, which I wholeheartedly regret. You see, Menards has these edge glued pine board that were the exact thickness that I needed. They were flat as can be and ready to cut, but like I said, that would have been too easy. So instead, I decided to grab these 2x4s, and if you know anything about 2x4s, you'll know they're straight up lying to you. Like, why call them a 2x4 if they're not a 2x4 when they're actually coming in at 1.5 by 3.5. It makes things difficult. Anyway, I needed the final thickness of my material to be at about 1.25 inches before machining. And you think, yeah, that's great, you have an extra 1/4 inch to work with. No. Again, I had failed to account for how terrible construction lumber is. These pieces were so warped. So as you saw, I had to do a bit of milling before the gluing process. While I was milling a few of the boards, I noticed my thickness kept getting shorter and shorter and shorter. At that point, I just said, screw it, I'm gonna get them relatively straight without making the pieces too skinny and glue them together. Well, here's how the glue up went. What that sound most likely was the boards snapping back into place to equalize the stress. That probably happened because I did a poor job of milling. Plus, I was working within the constraints of the material that I had. Like I tried to explain before, I couldn't mill everything completely flat or my final product would have been too skinny. That's why the glue up looked like this. Moving on, I had what I thought was a good idea to deal with these large gaps in the material, and that was to use some epoxy. So I started by making a giant mold out of some melamine board. Then I applied a seal coat. Oh yeah, I also burned the board to give it its final look because I thought it would stay, but we'll get to that. So yeah, clear coat, then about 30 separate coats after that. I was using a tabletop epoxy which could be applied in about a maximum of a 1/4 inch thickness, so this process took quite a long time. I was frustrated, and by the time I got to the end of this, I was furious. So I'm just going to skip to the machining part and let you know I wasted about $200 worth of epoxy. Yeah, I'm still a little salty about that, but you know, you live and you learn. You'll find out what I'm talking about pretty shortly here. I didn't show that I sprayed the mold with some releasing agent that Blacktail Studio recommended, but I still couldn't get the melamine off without chipping it to pieces. So from now on, I'm only going to be using Tyvek tape whenever I want to work with epoxy. Since I couldn't get the melamine off, I decided to make a quick program for the CNC router and let that do the work for me. Then I got to this point where the machine just started screeching, so I stopped to see what was up, and turns out the epoxy never actually got all the way underneath the piece. Yeah, stupid mistake. I should have used a thinner deep pour, but that's what I had laying around. Nonetheless, I got all the melamine off, then surfaced one side to about 1.5 inches, so that would leave me with a 1/4 inch to get off when I go to cut this board. I didn't surface the whole board because I wanted to use the second half for another project. So I worked my way over to the table saw and cut a few squares of stock that were ready to start machining. The machining process wasn't too hard. I just had to stop doing this. And once I did that, I was left with a rather curvy board, if I do say so myself. I tried to make the board the same contour as my butt cheeks, but don't ask me how I did that. After I got all 3 machined, I went and sanded the rough edges. After the sanding, I went back and reburned them. Do you remember I told you I wasted about $200 of epoxy? Can you guess where? Yeah, I machined it all off. You see, my original intention was to use the epoxy as a filler for the large gaps, but it turns out there was only a few low spots that required it. So I probably could have gotten away with just trying to fill the low spots, but for some reason I wasn't really looking that far ahead. So there you have it. After a few more top coats of epoxy, then a quick assembly, my butt was ready to sit itself in the most expensive bar stool I've ever made, even though they are the only ones. Anyway, I learned a lot. Hopefully you guys did too, or at least enjoyed watching me mess up. That's always. Thanks for watching. See you next time.